Well, good morning, good evening, and good afternoon, where you might be joining us from. And welcome to this policy webinar on the topic Infusing Ethics into AI. My name is Sassoon Gregorian, and I look after government affairs for APAC for Salesforce. And thank you for joining us. Before we start, I just want to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land that we all meet, and where I meet in particular on the Watamagal clan of the Eora Nation. I pay my respects to owners past, present, and emerging. So, what a fascinating topic. What is ethics? Well, ethics are the moral principles that govern a person's behavior or the conduct of an activity. And artificial intelligence ethics is concerned with the important question of how human developers, manufacturers, and operators should behave in order to minimize the ethical harms that can come from AI in society. Now, this is an issue that is really emerging all around the globe. We're seeing developments in Australia with a set of voluntary AI ethics principles set up. Singapore has developed a model AI governance framework. India, Niti Aayog, the policy think tank, is developing an approach towards ensuring responsible usage of AI in India. There's been work done at UNESCO, European Commission, and many other bodies around the world. So it's definitely a developing issue, and it's something that we're seeing a lot of movement on. And today, we are fortunate to be joined by a very esteemed and highly experienced panel. And let me introduce you to them briefly before we start our conversation. So we're joined by Kathy Baxter, who's the Principal Architect of Ethical AI Practice at Salesforce. Kathy develops research-informed best practice to educate Salesforce employees, customers, and the industry on the development of responsible AI. Welcome, Kathy. We're joined by David Hardin from Singapore, Senior Advisor for Data and Artificial Intelligence at Union Bank Philippines. Prior to his current role, David was Monetary Authority of Singapore's first appointed Chief Data Officer and Head of Analytics Group, as well as Special Advisor on Artificial Intelligence. Welcome, David. Edward Santo, Human Rights Commissioner at the Australian Human Rights Commission. Ed's area of expertise includes human rights, public law, and discrimination law. He is a visiting professorial fellow at the University of New South Wales and member of the World Economic Forum's Global Future Council on Human Rights. Welcome, Ed. And finally, we're joined by Dr. Rahul Panikar, who's Chief Research and Innovation Officer at Wadhwani AI. Wadhwani AI facilitates an active dialogue between the research community and the broader public to explore the ethical dimensions of AI research. Welcome, panelists. Thank you for joining us. What I'd like to start off with is ask an open question for all the panelists and provide some opening remarks. What I'd like to ask you is, in your opening remarks, if you can convey your thoughts about how your organizations or organizations you've worked for or managed, how have they addressed the issue or managed the issue of ethics in AI? And what I'd like to do is start off with Kathy Baxter, if you could please start the conversation for us. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me today. One of the first things that we did was create a trusted AI charter, a document that lays out what our AI principles would be as a company and identifies really specific measures for what does that look like in the company. And so our principles are responsible. We believe that we must safeguard all of the data that we are entrusted with and ensure that what we are building respects and protects human rights. It's accountable. We seek and leverage feedback from our customers, industry experts, civil society groups, transparency, being clear about how do we build our models through things like model cards, and also helping to explain to our users how our AI made the predictions or recommendations that it did. We believe that it needs to be empowering. We need to empower our users in how to use these tools responsibly. And then finally, it needs to be inclusive. It needs to respect the rights of everyone it impacts. So we think a lot about bias in data sets, the model itself, as well as how the model is applied and to whom. And so that was the foundation for all of the work that we've done from there, and build upon that with training all new hires that come into the company, and through our Agile development processes, baking specific reviews and guidelines in throughout the development process.
Thank you, Kathy. Ed, over to you. How are you dealing with it from the Australian Human Rights Commission perspective, and what are you seeing from your perspective?
So we started by asking what might seem like a really basic question, and that is, what does artificial intelligence do? There's so much enthusiasm about the rise of AI, and we share some of that enthusiasm. But we needed to really get to the bottom of something, and that was to ask, really, is AI enabling us to do wholly new things, or is it enabling us to do things that we've always done, but in new ways? So the answer to that question is really interesting, and it's the latter. So AI is not allowing us to do things like, teleport from one place to another. Instead, it's giving us very powerful new ways of making decisions, making predictions, and so on. And the reason why that's such an important, insight is because that really should give us a clear pointer in how we regulate the use and development of AI. So fundamentally, if we're already doing these things, we're just using AI to do them differently. So anything from making bank loans to making decisions about policing, to everything in between. There are already laws in place that should be the first port of call in working out what people can and can't do. And in particular, our human rights laws. So in the AI context, anti-discrimination laws, privacy laws, those should be the thing that we should look to. When it comes to ethics, therefore, that's secondary. So ethical rules don't and can never supplant the law. That's would be kind of legally meaningless and very dangerous, in fact. Instead, what ethics can do is that they can help us to uphold the law. It can fill the gaps where the law is silent, and can help companies and governments, for that matter, make decisions that are going to be more likely to be of benefit to people. But we mustn't lose sight of the fact that it is secondary to just following the law.
Thank you, Ed. Thank you for that insight. David, you're working in a bank now, but you also worked in a regulator before. Interested to see your perspective, having worked in those different sectors.
No, first of all, thank you very much for having me. It's always a pleasure to come and specifically talk about this topic. And yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, I now have the privilege and the pleasure of going from thinking about setting the rules and the governance and the policies to now being subjected to these rule governance and policies. But in fact, it's one that I'm particularly excited about because I'm a big believer of one has to eat their own pie. So maybe just giving it from a two perspectives point of view is, and when we kind of looking, okay, so let me start from the kind of regulatory perspective. When we kind of started thinking about it, it was really the case of what is the perimeter? And if I go back in time, cars actually started off without even seatbelts. Now, we've learned a lot. So it was really about that. What are those perimeters? What are those considerations that as organizations, and again, looking from a high level point of view, we need to start asking ourselves, thinking about, and just building up what Edwin was mentioning, the can't and can't, even going one step below and in the can, should versus shouldn't. Just because we can do it, maybe we shouldn't be doing it. Now, within an organization, as I mentioned, subjected to elements, is also having this perspective of well, can we bubble, bubble wrap this kind of world of AI with all the excitement that I thoroughly share into preventing all the potential errors, mistakes, incidents that may occur. Now, of course, keeping a separation from deliberate attempts that absolutely have to be prevented to those which, there was no intention. And that's sometimes the risk. There was no intention, but something happened. And the way that we're thinking about it and the way we're applying is what I like to consider of putting safety nets. That as much as possible, to what extent as possible, having the ability to review the methodologies, understanding the governance associated with AI, having the principles in place, the methodologies, but then having that secondary line of defense that if and almost when these algorithms in AI may go wrong, having a mechanism to check as to, is this insight, is this information something that we believe we can justify and something that we can act on? And if the answer is no, stop, pause, review, analyze, understand. Or if the answer is yes, we believe, go ahead, but have the capacity to constantly learn, constantly review, to adjust towards the situation on the landscape effectively. So kind of going from the policy perspective, the overview, to kind of the pragmatic implementation, the operationalization considerations of it.
Thank you, David. Rahul, over to you. I mean, Wadwani AI, what do you do? What are your thoughts about how this is managed with the organizations that you're working with?
Yeah. Thanks, Asun. We are a nonprofit AI for social good research institute. And what that means is we develop AI-based solutions to help underserved populations in developing countries. So we're working on technologies that can help identify low birth weight babies so that we can reduce infant mortality. We're working on technologies to predict adherence among TB patients or help smallholder cotton farmers. So we work with some of the most underserved populations in the world and look at how AI can be brought to the benefit of these populations. And our perspective in this is, I'd like to make a few points maybe in this regard. One is technology. I'm firmly of the belief that technologists cannot say that all I do is create technology. It's up to other people how it gets used. I'm not responsible how it gets used. No, technologists do have to take responsibility for the consequences of their creations. That's one. Secondly, ultimately, technology is an amplifier of human intent. Right? Since the day we discovered fire, we could cook food with it. We could fend off wild animals, have light at night, but we could also set fire to the neighboring village. Right? So what technology is used for ultimately comes to how it's wielded. And third is, to me, ethics is a big word, and it actually is worth unpacking. And I think some of that is what we'll do in this conversation today. It can mean something as simple as safety, not doing harm, delivering on promised efficacy, privacy, fairness, or it can mean not allowing concentration of power, right? So all of these are matters of ethics, and they need to be looked at differently. And so, I would sum this up as ethics in technology should not be solely the burden of technologists. It needs participation from many domains. It needs perspectives from law. It needs perspective from sociology, historical perspective. Things need to be human-centered. Business perspectives have to be brought in. And we need expertise from the application domain. It's too important and too complicated a subject to be solely the domain of technologists.
Thank you, Rahul. And for the audience that are watching, if you do have a question, please feel free to submit it through chat, and we'll endeavour to have your questions answered as well as part of the panel. Now, let me come to another issue. One of the things, particularly with ethics in AI, is this issue of whether you can get it designed early, particularly in products. So for many years, there's this been concept called privacy by design. So baking in privacy consideration in products early in the process, not later in the process where you then have to take remedial action. Are we doing ethics by design for products, currently? Are we not doing it, or are we doing it? What should we be doing in this respect? I mean, be interested in panelists' views, what their thoughts are on this. Would someone like to volunteer to lead on this particular issue? In that case,
Salesforce is.
So I'll go to Ed now. I'll go to Kathy. Please go ahead, Ed.
Okay.
I'll start and I'll say something controversial. I think we're doing one thing which is really good, but it's also really bad. We're talking about ethics in infusing that into design processes. And we're talking about it a lot. And in one sense, that's really good. But only a number of companies are actually doing it. And that's really bad. And it's bad because I think sometimes people are given a false sense of security because we have the language of ethics, which has really grown exponentially in the last couple of years to acknowledge the fact that there are serious risks associated with the AI. But unless there's, I guess, an agreed set of practical rules that are being applied in the design and development process, then it will be kind of all marketing language. It won't be kind of translating into real action. We've done, we didn't set out to do this, but it's turned out we've done the most extensive consultation anywhere in the world on the human rights implications of artificial intelligence. What we've heard again and again, often from companies being really honest with us on a confidential basis, is that it's actually very difficult. If you have a set of ethical principles that on their face look good, like, you know, do no harm, those sorts of things, it's easier to sign up to those. But if you're an engineer, let's say, and you're given two pieces of paper, the first is a very detailed brief of the AI-powered product or service that you're being asked to design. And the second piece of paper is a very high-level set of principles like do no harm. You know what to do with the first piece of paper? That's actually pretty straightforward. The second piece of paper, you go, I don't really know what to do with this because, you know, very, very few individuals or companies go out there to cause harm. It's actually in the micro decisions where you could go left or you could go right that, in fact, you end up sometimes in a situation where you do cause harm. So for us, what's the solution? For us, the solution is grounding ethics in something real and practical. So wherever possible, not having kind of company executives sit under a Bodhi tree and kind of dream up new ethical principles, because I think the moment for that is past. I think what we need to be doing wherever possible is saying, no, we already know the core things that humans need in order to be protected, and we're going to apply those very specifically to our particular context, so that when the engineer gets those two pieces of paper, they're in a sense equally useful for her or him, that they'll be able to apply those in a practical way.
Thank you, Ed. Kathy, you're going to add some comments as well from your perspective.
Yeah, so Salesforce works on the Agile development methodology, and so we have a set of questions that we ask teams that are building global models and templates during definition of ready and definition of done to ask. And so during those very early stages, we do an assessment with the team to identify what are all of the intended consequences of this AI applications? What are all of the unintended consequences? Who is going to be impacted by each of them? And what are all of the potential risks? And then we do an analysis of the likelihood of impact, the seriousness of the impact, who it's going to impact, and then we do an analysis of should this even continue to be developed. So before we even start building the model, before we even start collecting training data, should this thing exist in the first place? And then if the answer is yes, we start identifying what are all of the mitigation strategies that we need to put in place to ensure that those unintended harmful consequences can be mitigated as much as possible. We are a platform, and so what our customers do with our product may not always be directly in our control. So we have to do things like putting in-app guidance and education to make our customers aware. Are they using sensitive fields or their proxy variables when making decisions? How do they understand in their training data, is there disparate impact happening? And so giving our customers as many tools as possible, because whatever we do to ensure that what we're developing is responsible, that can all be thrown away if it goes into the hands of a customer that uses it irresponsibly, either with malicious intent or just with ignorance, naivety, or it could be they just use it in a completely different way than we anticipated. It's not necessarily harmful, it's just different from what we anticipated. So how do we put all of that education, all of that structure in place to help our customers do the right thing? Because the vast majority of times, it's when harm happens, it's not through malice, it's through lack of understanding of the context. It's lack of thinking about who is the entire population that's going to be impacted by that, and how do we get them in that mindset to do the right thing.
Thank you, Kathy. David, how about your thoughts? Ethics in design products early on. What are your thoughts about that, given what we're seeing privacy in design? I mean, Ed made some strong relation to that, but what about your thoughts?
Absolutely. I mean, I'd like to start off by, well, hopefully hoping and believing that we all want to do the right thing. So there's the necessity of those key principles from a designer point of view, from an engineer, and very much agree with all points, is that creators bear responsibility on their creations. But and not trying to go, metaphysical or philosophical about the topic, is we need to be very careful by the word by design, especially when we want to drive implementation, operationalization, and usage. What does that actually mean? And it's actually quite interesting that you use the term ethics by design, because so far I've always heard it as explainability by design, where my usual response is, what does that mean? Explainable to who? In what sense? In what context? Now, while it's not directly analogous to ethics, because you would like to believe that ethics is something that we can all agree about, but that's exactly where it gets a little more complicated. And again, depending on how you look at AI in general. While there are, I would like to believe, certain principle in ethics that we all shouldn't and don't argue about, once you go across different cultures, ethics takes certain different variations. So if you're going about building an AI methodology or solution algorithm, it's only applied within a specific context, specific culture, specific application, I don't think by design is an issue, because you can hard code it in effectively. But if you're building something that has more general sense and it needs to be applicable, let's say from east to west, well, how do you incorporate that by design when you have to deliberately allow for that certain flexibility, essentially? And then again, at the risk of going a bit philosophical, is if we look at history, and hopefully we're only improving with time, hopefully, ethics has also changed. So are we certain that, are we building something by design now that maybe 20 years from now, 50 years from now, we'll be having these exact same conversations about what we built by design because we need to change it given the ethics of then? So we need to kind of allow for that flexibility, and that's kind of what I was mentioning earlier, is that there are certain things that absolutely can be incorporated and must be incorporated, but we need to allow almost that second degree of defense. And just let me give you one last illustration of that. Humans actually, well, again, largely, when they say things, when they do things, it's largely two decision points. You think something, you want to enact something, but you'll have a secondary layer when you say to yourself, oh, I can't say that, that's wrong, or I can't do that, or I can do that. But it doesn't negate the fact that we may think it, it may be instinctive, but we control that. From an AI perspective right now, we've actually combined those two dimensions. We're trying to make a decision that is ethical, rather than the ability of making a decision and then a decision of its ethical applicability, essentially. So that's another thing that exploring and considering.
Thank you, David. Rahul, how about your point of view in terms of what you're doing. What's your perspective on this particular issue?
Yeah, again, big issue. I'd say a few things. I think many of the things alluded to already. Uh, it's uh, it is important that due thought is given to the ethical implications of technology created. However, history shows that there are always unintended consequences, and we cannot possibly anticipate all the ways in which technology gets used. Um, I mean, to take a modern day example, I'm pretty sure Brian Acton and Jan Koum never thought that WhatsApp would one day be weaponized and used for mob lynchings, for example. Right? I doubt that was ever in their mind as they created WhatsApp. And we can go back into lots and lots of technologies. Uh, so processes do have to be in place, and there are and so this is not specific to AI. There's a long history of how to establish processes that ensure safety in technology development. And the recommended process is a four-stage process, right? You start with control testing, safety, right? And in AI, that would be do things work on on a test set. Second is efficacy, and that you do in a control setting, control pilots. Third is uncontrolled pilots, effectiveness. Does it work in the real world? Right? But still with safeguards. But the fourth is actually the one that I would say is most important, which is post-deployment monitoring. Right? Because of that first thing I said, there's no way we can anticipate. And there's a lot we can draw from other domains. And maybe, David Speaker is fond of saying this, that we can draw a lot from healthcare, and this four-stage process is similar to what's followed in drugs in the pharma industry, where you just because you've evaluated in a large population does not mean that it's going to be safe. For the reason that Kathy said, that it gets used in context, in use cases that one can never anticipate because the world is changing, people are changing, and you know what, we cannot anticipate these things. So my recommendation would be appropriate it's process and systems that can save us, and not anticipation.
Thank you, Rahul. I just want to pivot now on a different area, and that is the role of government. What role does government have in ethics in AI? You know, we've seen this in different parts of the world. There've been frameworks developed. You know, industry says they've got their own principles which they follow by. Does this need to be regulated? Does it need to be guided? What is the best approach or role government should play? And I'm looking particularly at Ed and David. Ed working for a government statutory body. David previously working for a government regulator. Interested in particularly your thoughts. What is the role in government, and does it vary by jurisdiction, or what is the best approach on this very fast evolving and changing issue?
Well, I'm not quite sure whether I'm qualified to say what is the best approach, but at least to give my view in terms of the role of government, I think it's critical, to say the least, because governments are usually the voice and the representation of the people. They are the custodians of and the fiduciary responsibility of the ethical representation of what people believe in. And just to give a real life example of that is, again, while I think as all of us as human beings have a basic moral responsibility, when you work for a company that is commercially based and there's nothing wrong in making a profit, there's nothing wrong in the revenue, that's the objective, that's the intention. You need a higher force to come and say, look, I'm sorry, but you need to contrast that goal with this because of A, B, and C. So you will always need to have that count. And actually, that's the role, maybe less perhaps nowadays on the ethical aspect of it, but that's the role of regulators when it comes to finance, transportation. I mean, that's exactly it. It's the check and balances. And that's, in fact, something that I've learned, because I came from industry to regulator back to industry. My kind of take home and my appreciation of it is that, in fact, we shouldn't fear it. We should warmly welcome it, and there needs to be a very, very open, honest, and sometimes difficult dialogue, because it's checks and balances. It's not about trying to make your life difficult or telling you what you can't do. No, it's exactly what we're saying. It's telling you what you can do, but then having that deep conversation, especially in this nuance of AI, where we don't have the luxury of 100 years to evolve and mature policies, in terms of having that conversation of, okay, we know you can do that. We can see the value, but should you be doing it? Should you asking yourself of, can it be weaponized? Can this happen? As we are maturing and evolving the policies, that we may come and say, look, I'm sorry, you're not allowed to do it. If you do that, hypothetically speaking, as an insurer, you may result in a situation that someone will have a premium that is unaffordable vis-a-vis a premium that's negligible, and we don't believe that's the right thing, and we will force the upper and lower bar where you can play in between. You see, so those kind of things, you have to have the dialogue, but to me, the organization that's responsible and accountable to drive that has to be the government. That's kind of the reason they're there.
Thank you, David. Ed, please.
Yeah, I've got a similar view. And in a sense, it should surprise us, maybe even shock us, that we're even having this discussion, right? And part of the reason, because it speaks to a kind of a deep confusion about what the role of government is. And I think part of the confusion is because we're not all talking about the same thing when we talk about ethics. And we keep on asking these really fundamental questions that were answered literally centuries ago. So when we say something like, should there be regulation in this area? As I say, we have been doing these things, and they have been regulated for decades, if not centuries. So there's already regulation. There's no question of should. It's already there. It's whether it should be enforced more effectively. Maybe I can give a practical illustration of what I mean. Let's say you have a bank, like an actual bank, a building, an office building, right? And there's a big window, and in the window is a sign that says, women can't come into this bank. We're not going to do any business with women. We would all agree that that is completely unacceptable, but we would go further than that, I think, in saying that's not an ethical problem, that's a legal problem, right? Like the bank is in flagrant violation of the law, certainly here in Australia or in the United States. I would imagine in the Philippines and in India as well. But let's tweak that scenario. Let's instead say that the woman applies online for a home loan, and that home loan application is processed using an algorithm. Maybe it's wholly automated, maybe it's partially automated, but ultimately she's denied a bank loan. And let's say that the reason she's denied a bank loan is because the algorithm, basically there's algorithmic bias built into the system, and she suffers, a grave unfairness, injustice. For some reason, if we frame it like that, we tend to think of it as an ethical question. It is not. It is absolutely not an ethical question. It is just as unlawful as the first scenario. And we need to be crystal clear that those two things are essentially the same thing. So back to your question, Sassoon, I think the role of government is clear. The role of government is to clearly articulate the law and to enforce the law. It's not primarily to get involved in, establishing ethical principles, because what the ethical principles should do is, as I said before, fill the interstices between the law. Where there are gaps in the law, where the law is silent, ethical principles can be developed by civil society, by industry, by academia, to guide people to do what is more likely to be the right thing.
Thank you. Rahul, I can see that you wanted to also make some comments in relation to this in terms of government.
Yeah, just to add to what David and Edward said, we talk about regulating AI, and I think often I fear that that's coming from looking at either in some cases it's out of fear of killer robots, or in other cases it's saying, oh, there's algorithmic bias, and so we need to regulate AI, right? Or I mean, I could unpack that more, but I think I don't think that's the most beneficial way to actually look at this. That's sort of like saying we should regulate chemistry, right? No, I mean we should regulate chemical weapons. We should regulate pharmaceuticals. We should regulate pesticides, and we should regulate textiles, right, for human safety. They need to be looked at differently. Analogously, in AI, we should look at this from the domain of applications, right? Self-driving cars have to be regulated differently from healthcare AI, which has to be regulated differently from AI used in banking, as Edward said. And because it's the application domain that identifies the use case, the potential risks, and the stakeholder ecosystem on how much of the risks and safety mechanisms that particular industry and those organizations may be in a place to even implement, or what capabilities are needed, because otherwise this will be on paper. So I would say regulation should be application focused.
I'd like to take it one step
But if I can just say one thing.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, I'll just really quickly. I was nodding my head so much in what Rahul was saying that I've got a sore neck. I just wanted to say how much I strongly agree.
I want to take what he said one step further. So as we think about the regulation being app specific, so often an example is given of the difference between a recommendation system for movies to watch versus a recommendation system for should someone get bail or parole. One seems like a very trivial manner. What movie should you watch next? Whereas the other is impacting your right to freedom and justice. But we also have to think about how does that application go about collecting the data and doing what it's doing. So if a system made movie recommendations based on the smart speaker sitting in the kitchen next to you and it's always listening in on your conversation, it's like, ooh, that sounds like you should watch Sixth Sense tonight, and all of a sudden, you see this popped up. That's now surveillance. The end result is something as trivial as recommending a movie for you to watch, but how does it go about collecting information? How is that information handled and used? And so a large part of the conversation that we have internally is around responsible data collection and use. And what are consumer expectations? We all have the millions of informed consents that we've blindly clicked on because it's in legalese. Even if you took the time, the 3 hours to read through that document, you wouldn't understand it in the first place, and you've signed away your right to all of this data. Is that ethical? It might be legal, but is that even ethical? So I think there is a lot to unpack as we think about what parts of this need to be regulated.
So just not to belabor topic, but I just really had to jump in, and I thoroughly agree with everyone that's saying, but I just wanted to really kind of tap on that particular point, which I absolutely love, Kathy. And I think kind of where maybe not disagree, but add to what Edward mentioned about the legal dimension to it and the ethical dimension, why I still believe government has a role to play in ethics. And again, give you an example, GDPR. The objective and the goal of it, thoroughly agree. The implementation of it, what has resulted is now companies are hiding behind legality that we've given you the option to tick in the box. But the outcome is consent fatigue. People have no idea what they're consenting to. So the objective was there, completely has missed the point, but now it's created a legal umbrella where companies are protected.
Kathy, going back to your earlier comments, in fact, what you were mentioning about data and surveillance actually reminds me of a book of The Age of Surveillance Capitalism, a very fascinating book actually talking about the things that you raised. We do have a question from the audience, which I wanted to firstly direct to Kathy and Rahul and then David to join.
Sorry,
David,
I obviously said something that someone out there in the ether didn't like. Not talking about
why don't you finish your comment?
Sorry, so just to quickly wrap up, what I was saying is that ultimately we need to make sure that we have the legality, we have the mechanism, we don't have to reinvent the wheel, but we need to constantly, and from a regulatory point of view, from a policy perspective, look at the gaps. Are we really meeting the objective? And one example of that is consent. It's a very simple test. Do you know what you've consented to? If the answer to that is no, to me the legality is irrelevant, because actually I don't know what I've consented to. So has it met the goal? Has it met the smell test effectively? So there's a need to separate these two and making sure that ultimately greed and excitement and interest and possibilities don't outweigh the simple question is that you shouldn't be motivated to do the right thing. I mean,
Thank you, David, and apologies for the technical interruption in between. I want to now draw a question from the audience, and I want to first of all direct it to Kathy and then maybe move it to Rahul and to David. The question is, how does a company like Salesforce or organization like Wadhwani AI can refer to Union Bank as well, eliminate the human bias (social cultural) in its AI designs and processes and make them more inclusive? Any examples?
Yeah, so we intentionally, as we are working on our AI systems, we never claim that anything is bias-free. There is no such thing as a bias-free data set. There is always going to be some level of bias. And so when we talk about it, we are very explicit in saying this is the type of bias that we are looking for. So going back to a point that was made earlier about how values within a culture change over time. And so when we talk about gender, we are very cognizant that data sets often are recording only two genders. Today, when we talk about gender, we talk about it as a spectrum. And so automatically, if you are collecting only two genders in your analysis, there is a level of bias there. We talk about race as not simply a checkbox, like you are one thing and none of the others. So when we're going through and we're doing our analysis, we're very specific in stating what are the kinds of biases that we looked for, how did we look for them, what was the mechanism that we used to test for it, and then what was the level that we got it to. And when we publish model cards, for folks that might not be familiar, they're like nutrition labels for models. You give details about what was the training data that you used, did you do any cleaning or any processing of the data, what were the factors that you used in your model and the weightings, ethical considerations, performance metrics, all of that other stuff. So when we talk about these kinds of things in the model, then that's where we lay these things out. And as models are updated, teams are expected to update their model cards. And so we may realize in one of our models that there's a type of bias in there that we hadn't identified, we hadn't looked for. We need to go back and do that again. So this is always an iterative process, and we are never going to stake a claim, make a claim that something that we have created is bias-free, because you just can't make that claim.
Thank you, Kathy. Rahul, how about yourself?
Yeah, I'll mention maybe three things that we do, but before that, maybe some context. Kathy referred to about bias, and that's certainly one big problem. And we look at, in addition to that, there's a number of other issues we look at, right? So, for example, when a healthcare worker goes and assesses a new mother's baby, right? What are the privacy considerations there, right? When a new AI-based tool is available that can potentially decrease health risk for the baby, right? How does that shift the power balance between the healthcare worker and the mother, or change the power equation for the mother in the family? So I just want to say that there's many aspects to look at when we look at ethics of AI, and bias is one key factor, but it is only one factor, right? In order to look at all of these, it's a big the problem's big, but I'll mention maybe three things we do. One is co-design, right? We actually design our solutions with users and stakeholders as part of the design process. That's one. Second is whenever possible, and that's pretty much in everything we do actually, we have external expertise do reviews, and especially whenever possible, mandated reviews. For example, all our healthcare work goes through IRB, institutional review boards. And the third thing I'd say is process. Again, we've had multiple conversations about what needs to be done to have systematic process. Kathy referred to model cards. I also mentioned a 4-stage process. And in that, ultimately, I think it's that process. And like I said earlier, I'll repeat what I said. Post-deployment monitoring and with safeguards in place, continuously needed.
Dave, I'll just quickly repeat the question for you. So how does a company like Union Bank eliminate, or I guess mitigate, the human bias, social culture into AI designs and processes and make them more inclusive? Any examples?
So I probably need to break down that question to multiple points, and just to repeat Kathy's comment, which I think is absolutely relevant, and we all need to consciously remember it, is there's no such thing as eliminating bias. Our humanity defines that. And in fact, bias by definition is actually not a negative term. It's whether it's resulting in unfair or disadvantagement to individuals. So again, just want to put that into context, because I'm sure every one of us wants to walk into a bank and say, like, can I have a private bank, please? You may or may not get it, depending on the circumstances. So that's one. Secondly, with respect to the question of how to still go about and eradicating the negative bias that we're not interested in. On the human dimension, of course, it's a part of a training. When it comes to the AI aspect of it, as I mentioned, it first and foremost is awareness. When I studied machine learning back in university long ago, this wasn't at the back of mind, not because of any malicious intent of people. It just wasn't there. It just like the realization of the necessity of seatbelts in the car just wasn't there in the beginning, but now it is. So it's important that people keep it in mind, look at the data, look at the outcomes with a different lens, and ask themselves those questions. Is this justifiable? Does this make sense? Do I have concern about it? What is the potential implication? And also having the relevant committees, again, not just in a formal sense, can be an informal sense, of people that come from different perspectives, different viewpoints. And I find that the best way is actually having business people, PR people, marketing people, etc., which have nothing to do with the world of data science, looking at it and saying, does this make sense? And then finally, as I kind of was mentioning, is that safety net. Look, no matter how safe the car, there will be accidents for numerous reasons. The same approach has to be taken when it comes to AI. No matter how safely you design it, there will be accidents. That's why it is critical to build in safety bags. It's critical to create safety nets that we're able to catch it. We're able to go, oh, no, we don't think that's in the right path, and we have an ability. So this is the whole approach of human in the loop, over the loop, whichever way you want to call it, essentially. It's absolutely important. And then finally, and because especially in the case of the Philippines, whereby we're looking at driving financial inclusion, providing and facilitating financial services for those who are underbanked or unbanked. And that by definition means either people who are discriminated against, they were excluded because of whatever reason they were come in. It means we need to fundamentally think differently how we approach it, how do we look at it, how do we model it. But then again, making sure we're not doing it in a way that will result in downstream potential discrimination and disadvantagement. So it's starting with the end. We want to make sure everyone has an equal opportunity, but we're able to justify the circumstances because we're also accountable to regulators. But working backwards and making sure we're doing the right thing. So it's multiple tiered and multiple leveled approach.
Thank you, David. We're very close approaching towards the end of our time. And if I can just ask the panelists in 10 seconds, each of you, what's the one leave behind you want to convey to the audience here about infusing ethics into AI? If there's one message you want to share in 10 seconds, what is that? I know I'm putting you on the spot, but you're very clever and smart people. Perhaps I'll start with you, Ed, first.
The starting point is, what does the law require? Do that to make sure that people's human rights are protected in that way, and then look at how ethical principles can fill the gaps.
Kathy?
Every single person has a role in ethics. Who you are as an employee, what company you work for, what you're willing to build or not build. As a consumer, who are you willing to give your data and your attention to? As voters, who do you vote for? What do you vote for? What do you demand? The safeguards and regulations to be put in place. So every single individual has a role in the technology that impacts society today.
Thank you, Kathy. Rahul, 10 seconds. You may.
Continuous post-deployment monitoring.
Thank you. And David?
Three things. I think starting point is mutual respect. We can disagree with one another, but we need to have mutual respect. Context, and then finally, operationalization. Just talking about ethics is not good enough. We need to implement it.
Thank you very much for our panelists. I want to pay a particular thank you for the Observer Research Foundation who partnered with us on this policy webinar. This is a very, very fascinating topic. I want to particularly thank our panelists, Kathy Baxter, Edward Santo, Rahul Panika, David Hardoon. Thank you for joining us. This is a conversation that we're starting. Salesforce will be releasing some research into this as well in the not too distant future. So thanks again for your participation. And everyone, have a very good day. Thank you for joining us.